As you settle in and let your eyes grow heavy, imagine the vast lands of the American West long before wagons rolled and railroads hummed. Stretching from the tall Rocky Mountains all the way to the quiet shores of the Pacific, the West was once an immense, mostly unmapped region, a place European settlers barely understood. Yet it had been home for thousands of years to indigenous nations whose cultures were deeply rooted in the land. Fact 1. Indigenous peoples lived in the West for thousands of years before European settlement. These nations, like the Apache, Navajo, Ute, Shoshone, and countless others, moved with the rhythm of the seasons. Some followed migrating bison, while others tended crops beside rivers that flowed quietly year after year. Fact 2. Many native nations were nomadic or semi-nomadic, while others practiced settled agriculture. European maps of the early 1800s showed the West as vast blank spaces, mysterious regions labeled only as frontier. Few non-native people had seen these lands, though Spanish explorers had journeyed through the Southwest centuries earlier. Fact 3. Spain explored and settled parts of the West long before the U.S. expanded there. Change truly began in 1803, when the young United States made a purchase that doubled its size almost overnight, the Louisiana Purchase. For just a few $1,000,000, the U.S. acquired a huge stretch of territory from France, though at the time, almost no one knew what lived or grew across it. Fact 4. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the United States. To learn more, President Thomas Jefferson sent two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, on a long journey westward. Their expedition lasted more than 2 years, crossing plains, mountains, and rivers until they finally reached the Pacific Ocean. They mapped rivers, recorded plants and animals, and met many native nations along the way, gathering knowledge that would shape the country's future. Fact 5. The Lewis and Clark expedition mapped and documented Western lands from 1804 to 1806. But the West was still quiet. Settlers had not yet begun to pour in. That would come later, encouraged by a growing idea. One that whispered that the nation was meant to stretch from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. That belief would eventually be called Manifest Destiny. Fact 6. Manifest Destiny was the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand westward to the Pacific. In the early 1800s, the first Americans to travel deep into the West weren't settlers at all, but fur trappers. These mountain men lived rugged, solitary lives, following rivers, trapping beavers, and trading pelts that were prized for fashionable hats in Europe. Their paths would later become trails for thousands of travelers. Fact 7. Fur trappers were among the first Americans to explore the far west. As the decades passed, more and more people began drifting toward the horizon. Some traveled for adventure, some seeking land, and others simply searching for a new beginning. Their journeys were slow, quiet, and uncertain, following routes that would soon become famous. Trails like the Oregon Trail, stretching thousands of miles across plains and mountains. Fact 8. The Oregon Trail became one of the main migration routes to the West. And as the sun set each night along these trails, the world seemed endless. Prairies glowing gold, rivers shimmering, and the soft creak of wagon wheels marking the steady pace of a nation beginning its long, slow movement westward. The great story of Western colonization was only just beginning, and with each passing day, the land itself would shape the dreams, hardships, and hopes of the people who crossed it. Fact 9. Early westward migration began slowly, long before mass settlement. As the quiet movement westward continued, the land itself seemed to guide travelers into new territories. By the 1830s, small groups of families began gathering their belongings, tools, blankets, precious keepsakes, and loading them into wooden wagons. These were not hurried journeys. They moved with the rising sun, stopping whenever storms rolled across the plains or the wheels sank into soft earth. Fact 10. Westward wagon migrations increased significantly in the 1830s. Travelers often relied on trails first shaped by indigenous peoples, then widened by fur traders and explorers. There were no highways, only long paths across vast grasslands. Along these routes, pioneers walked far more than they rode, sometimes covering 15 or 20 miles a day on foot. Fact 11. Most migrants walked beside their wagons, traveling long daily distances. To reach the west, settlers had to cross the Great Plains, a region that many early Americans mistakenly believed was a barren wasteland. Explorers had once called it the Great American Desert, imagining that almost nothing could grow there. Of course, the plains were rich with wildlife and sustained thriving indigenous nations, but settlers only slowly began to understand the land's true nature. Fact 12. Early Americans labeled the Great Plains the Great American Desert. As families continued moving westward, they formed wagon trains, long lines of covered wagons that offered safety in numbers. At night, these wagons often circled together, not to defend against attacks as Hollywood once suggested, but simply to create a sheltered place to sleep and to keep animals from wandering off. Fact 13. Wagon circles were mostly used for organization and containing animals, not constant defense. Communication between these moving groups and the world back east was incredibly slow. A letter could take months to travel in either direction, carried by stagecoach or horseback across rugged terrain. Because of this distance and silence, many settlers began to feel that the West was a world of its own, a place where time stretched out softly and the horizon felt endless. Fact 14. Postal communication across the West was slow, often taking months. It wasn't only American settlers who traveled these trails. Immigrants from Europe also joined the long journey, searching for the promise of land and opportunity. Some came from Germany, some from Scandinavia, and many from Ireland, carrying with them traditions, languages, and hopes that would eventually shape Western towns. Fact 15. Large numbers of European immigrants migrated westward in the mid-1800s. By the 1840s, certain landmarks became familiar resting points, towering shapes rising from the landscape, guiding travelers like natural signposts. Chimney Rock in Nebraska, Independence Rock in Wyoming, and the broad sweep of the Platte River all became symbols of progress on the long, often exhausting journey. Fact 16. Travelers used prominent natural landmarks on the trails as navigation points. Each of these stops brought a mixture of relief and reflection. People carved their names into rock, left notes for friends behind them, or built small cairns to mark a moment in time. These tiny gestures, scattered across the West, still remain in some places today, quiet reminders of those who passed through long ago. Fact 17. Many migrant inscriptions and markers from the 1800s still survive along old trails. And yet, as settlers pushed farther, life grew more challenging. The weather shifted without warning. Rivers rose suddenly. Herds of bison moved across the plains in thunderous waves. Still, the promise of open land and new beginnings kept the wagons rolling mile after mile, deeper into lands that had been inhabited since ancient times. Fact 18. Settlers faced harsh weather, wildlife migrations, and difficult terrain during their travels. The great movement west was gaining momentum, and with every sunrise, thousands more followed the trails carved by those before them, guided by hope, ambition, and the quiet determination that defined them. As more travelers crossed the wide plains and followed the long trails west, a new chapter slowly began to unfold. By the mid-1840s, thousands of people were making the journey each year, and the rhythm of migration became almost seasonal, waves of wagons leaving in spring when the snow melted, hoping to reach their destinations before the winter returned. Fact 19. Most wagon migrations departed in spring to avoid winter hazards. Families often carried guidebooks filled with advice, though many of these guides were written by people who had never traveled the trails themselves. Some offered optimistic maps, promising easy shortcuts or lush valleys that didn't truly exist. These misleading guides sometimes caused travelers to take dangerous detours. Fact 20. Many westward migration guidebooks were inaccurate and sometimes harmful. The journey required enormous preparation. Settlers packed flour, bacon, beans, coffee, and barrels of water. They brought tools, ropes, spare wagon parts, and sometimes a few precious books. But despite all the planning, many travelers still found themselves overwhelmed by the distance. Items they thought essential were often left behind on the trail to lighten the wagons. Fact 21. Migrants commonly abandoned heavy belongings along the trails. As the migration intensified, Small way stations began appearing, trading posts and forts where travelers could rest, repair wagons, or replenish supplies. Places like Fort Laramie and Fort Bridger became crucial oases, offering shelter, blacksmiths, and brief moments of calm before travelers continued westward. Fact 22. Frontier forts served as supply and rest points for westbound travelers. Along the way, settlers met and interacted with indigenous nations. Some encounters were peaceful, involving trade, guidance, or help crossing rivers. Native people sometimes offered food, horses, or directions across difficult terrain. For many years, such interactions were more common than conflict. Fact 23. Early interactions between migrants and indigenous groups were often peaceful and involved trade. Still, tension gradually grew as more and more settlers entered lands that had long belonged to native nations. The enormous movement of people strained hunting grounds, disrupted seasonal patterns, and introduced new diseases. These changes would eventually reshape the West in profound and often tragic ways, though in the early years, many settlers still felt they were simply passing through. Fact 24. Westward migration put pressure on indigenous lands, resources, and populations. As the trail climbed into the high country, travelers faced some of the most difficult terrain. The Rocky Mountains rose like a great stone wall, demanding strength and patience. Wagons sometimes had to be unloaded and pulled by ropes up steep slopes. The thin air and cold nights tested everyone's endurance. Yet reaching the mountain passes felt like touching the sky, a moment of triumph and relief. Fact 25. Crossing the Rocky Mountains was one of the hardest parts of the journey. Beyond the mountains, landscapes changed once more. Sagebrush plains stretched quietly, dust swirling in the distance. Here, travelers entered regions claimed by Mexico, where Spanish-speaking ranchers, traders, and indigenous communities had built their own ways of life for generations. Fact 26. Much of the Southwest was Mexican territory before U.S. expansion. Over time, these cultural worlds began to blend, American settlers, indigenous nations, and Mexican communities interacting through trade, conflict, cooperation, and sometimes through shared hardship. Their stories became intertwined across deserts, rivers, and deep canyons. Fact 27. The West developed through a mix of cultures, American, indigenous, and Mexican, shaping its identity. As the sun set on the long trails and travelers camped beneath star-filled skies, the West remained a land of hope and uncertainty. The journey was far from over, and new events were about to transform everything, attracting an even greater wave of people toward the setting sun. As the quiet movement across the trails continued, a single discovery would change the West forever. In 1848, at a sawmill along the American River in California, a worker named James Marshall noticed something shimmering in the water, small flakes of gold, catching the light like tiny stars. Fact 28. Gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California in 1848. Word of this discovery traveled slowly at first, carried by letters and whispers. But when newspapers confirmed it in 1849, a tidal wave of hope swept across the nation. Tens of thousands of people hurried toward California, some on foot, some with wagons, and others sailing around South America or crossing through Panama. Fact 29. The California Gold Rush caused one of the largest mass migrations in U.S. history. These gold seekers, soon called 49ers, came from every corner of the world. Americans, Europeans, Chinese immigrants, and people from Latin America all converged on the same rivers and hillsides, searching for fortune in the shimmering dust of the Sierra Nevada. Fact 30. The gold rush attracted migrants from many countries, including a large number from China. Mining towns appeared almost overnight. Wooden shacks, tents, and muddy streets formed bustling settlements where people worked from dawn to dusk. Supplies were scarce and expensive, but opportunity felt boundless. In places like San Francisco, the population exploded from a sleepy village into a booming city in just a few years. Fact 31. San Francisco's population surged rapidly because of the gold rush. Yet the search for gold was unpredictable. Some miners found small fortunes, many did not. Life was harsh, and the work was exhausting, long days spent in cold rivers, sifting sand and gravel, all for the chance of discovering a few glittering flakes. The dream of striking it rich kept everyone going, even when the odds were low. Fact 32. Most gold miners earned little despite the wealth found in the region. The gold rush had far-reaching effects beyond the mining camps. With so many newcomers, California changed rapidly. Towns grew, roads expanded, and ships filled harbors. The United States moved quickly to organize the region, and by 1850, California had become a state faster than nearly any territory before it. Fact 33. California became a U.S. state in 1850, just 2 years after the gold rush began. But beneath the excitement, the gold rush brought great strain to indigenous communities. Lands were taken, rivers were disrupted, and diseases spread with devastating consequences. The arrival of so many settlers transformed ancient homelands in ways that could never be undone. Fact 34. The gold rush caused severe displacement and loss for native Californian populations. The sudden growth of mining also sparked technological change. People built sluice boxes, water wheels, and later, massive hydraulic systems that washed away hillsides to reach gold buried deep underground. These methods yielded more gold but scarred the landscape for generations. Fact 35. Hydraulic mining became common in the 1850s, dramatically altering the environment. As the gold fields matured, merchants, farmers, and ranchers followed behind the miners, supplying goods and food. In many cases, those who sold supplies earned far more than those who dug for gold, shaping California into an economic powerhouse. Fact 36. Many gold rush-era merchants became wealthier than the miners themselves. And so, as the 1850s dawned, the quiet push west had become a surge, rivers of people flowing toward opportunity, transforming the landscape, reshaping the nation, and forever changing the story of the American frontier. As the 1850s unfolded, life on the frontier became a delicate balance of hope and hardship. New settlers kept arriving, drawn by stories of fertile valleys and vast open ranges. To support these growing communities, small towns began to appear on the map. Quiet clusters of wooden buildings with a few shops, a blacksmith, and a single dusty road stretching through the center. Fact 46. Frontier towns grew around essential services like blacksmiths, general stores, and wagon shops. Most of these towns were modest and peaceful, far from the bustling cities of the East. A typical day might begin with the soft ringing of a hammer at the forge, or the muffled sound of wagons rolling into the square for supplies. Travelers exchanged news from distant territories, and neighbors often relied on one another for survival, sharing tools, food, or shelter when times grew difficult. Fact 47. Frontier communities were built on cooperation, as settlers depended on each other. By this time, farming was expanding everywhere the soil could be coaxed into productivity. Settlers planted wheat, corn, and vegetables, often battling droughts, insects, and unpredictable seasons. Those who succeeded built small ranches and homesteads that glowed with lantern light at night, isolated but full of quiet pride. Fact 48. Farming and homesteading became central to settlement across the West. Cattle ranching began to take shape as well. Spanish and Mexican traditions, such as open-range grazing and skilled horseback herding, laid the foundation for what would later become the legendary cowboy culture. Long before Hollywood imagined it, real ranch hands worked long, silent days guiding herds across open grasslands. Fact 49. Western ranching and cowboy culture developed from Spanish and Mexican traditions. But even as new towns blossomed, the sense of isolation remained strong. Supplies from the east could take months to arrive, and weather could change a season's harvest overnight. For many families, churches or schoolhouses offered more than education or faith. They became anchors of community, places where people gathered to feel less alone beneath the vast skies. Fact 50. Schools and churches often served as central gathering places in frontier towns. Travel across the West was still challenging, but new trails continued to open. The Oregon, California, and Santa Fe trails had become well-traveled paths, shaped by decades of footsteps and wagon wheels. But settlers also forged smaller routes. paths to mining camps, ranches, forts, and new homesteads hidden in distant valleys. Fact 51. Alongside major trails, many smaller migration routes developed as settlements spread. As populations grew, the U.S. government increased its involvement in Western affairs. New territories were organized, laws were introduced, and military forts were established not only to guard borders but also to protect settlers and trade routes. These outposts played an increasingly important role in regulating movement and managing tensions. Fact 52. The government established forts and territorial structures to manage the expanding West. Despite these efforts, conflict continued to rise. Disputes over land, resources, and boundaries created friction among settlers, indigenous communities, and ranchers. Each group had its own history, its own traditions, and its own claim to the land. The West was becoming a crossroads of competing worlds. Fact 53. Growing settlement created clashes over land between settlers and indigenous nations. Still, daily life on the frontier carried on in its gentle rhythm, sunrise bringing work, sunset bringing rest, and nights filled with starry skies stretching endlessly across the quiet plains. Even in times of hardship, many settlers felt a deep sense of belonging, believing they were helping shape a new future in the shadow of the frontier. Fact 54. Many settlers felt they were building a new future despite the challenges of frontier life. As the decade drew to a close, the West was no longer a distant dream. It was becoming a living tapestry of cultures, challenges, and possibilities. But far greater changes were still approaching, waiting just beyond the horizon.